Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Queer CME podcast. I am so excited today to welcome CP Hoffman from the National Center for Transgender Equality. CP uses they, them pronouns. CP, do you want to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do with NCTE?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me today. So CP Hoffman, CP stands for a whole lot of things, carrier pigeon. My favorite is correct pronouns. Yeah, that's the best one. That's the one everyone loves. Cheese pizza is another good one. I am a senior policy counsel at the National Center for Trans Equality in DC, where I am doing a lot of work on transgender healthcare, which is always a super exciting portfolio to be on.
Yes, right. There's always so much. We were just saying right before we started recording, the bar is really low, even in the places where we have great access and legal protections. There's still so much room for more.
Indeed, yeah. I live in Maryland, just outside of DC, and we have some very favorable laws here, but there's also a lot of work that we still have to do. And fortunately, I have some fabulous colleagues that are working in Maryland to work on a lot of that. And I'm helping out to the extent I can, though I do have to sort of divide my attention among the other 49 states and the various territories.
Yes. CP, we do usually try to prioritize folks with lived experience on our podcast. So if you'd be comfortable sharing how you identify, I would love to have that for our listeners to know.
Of course. So I am a trans feminine non-binary person. I am, this always surprises people when I tell them because apparently I have good skin, but I am in my early 40s. And thank you, Mother, for these wonderful genetics. And I lived most of my life sort of trying to figure out what it was that I was, because for those of us who are non-binary folks who aren't in the younger generations, there really wasn't terminology for us. And it was really hard to sort of figure out why we sort of felt like we were something different, a third thing, or, a 17th thing, depending on, your case. Yeah, so I when I'm doing trainings on trans issues and gender identity, I often, get to this question of, well, how do you describe what gender identity is? And sort of the old way that people used to describe it as like a line where, it's like one point is masculine and one point is feminine, and you fall somewhere on that scale. And you see this on a lot of things like the gender unicorn and, stuff. I like to think of gender as much more of a like 3 or 4 dimensional thing. So when I'm talking about my own gender, I ask people to imagine a large field. And somewhere in the middle of the field, there are a couple of boxes that, one says man or has like, that Mars symbol, and the other says woman or has the Venus symbol. But my gender is not either of those boxes. It's a cat that's roaming around through the field that will sometimes lay down in one of the boxes and get cozy because, like if it fits, it sits. But it doesn't necessarily fit well in the other box. But just because it's sometimes in the one doesn't mean that that's where it is all the time when it's like wandering off chasing a squirrel or a bird or whatever.
Right? Cats are very adventurous.
Yeah.
I love that analogy. Yeah. We definitely reference oh my gosh, brain fog.
Gender unicorn?
No, although I do share the gender unicorn sometimes when I present. I tend to use the trans language primer. It uses the galaxy model, like universe model. I'm like, what is the thing we live in? The universe, right, which is a multidimensional approach. And so that tends to be the one we reference people back to, because similar to you, my gender doesn't fit on a gradient scale 2-dimensional line. So I love that reference there.
And I love adding on the part where the cat the fourth dimension of time where the cat moves. It isn't always in one location.
Yeah, that's a really fabulous part of the analogy. And I just like, I don't know, I feel like queers, we love cats. So right? And cats love boxes. So I just think it's a great analogy overall. Anyways, we were getting together today to talk about kind of the state of access to healthcare and legislation around healthcare for our trans and gender diverse community. And so we were talking before we recorded, most of our listeners are healthcare clinicians, so physicians, nurse practitioners, PAs who offer gender affirming care in their practice or learning how to. And so there has been so much happening in the political climate with gender affirming care and access. And I was wondering if you could maybe, this is a really big, broad question, but could you give us like a general overview of like where we are as a country with the like access to care legislative pieces that have been happening?
Yeah, and I will say that this is definitely a multi-level question. So I will start at the top level, which is the federal system, and then I'll talk about what we're seeing at the states and how that differs. So your audience is probably fairly familiar with the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, and Section 1557 of that, which was the non-discrimination rule that was built into the ACA. So it's a really interesting, this is just a side note, but it's a really interesting like non-discrimination law, because if you look at most non-discrimination laws, they're like, these are the protected classes. But the ACA instead is like, the protected classes are the ones referenced in these other statutes. So it's very fun to try to figure out what everything means, because you have to like cross-reference cases, analyzing other statutes, etc. But at the end of the day, one of the classes protected that comes in through Title IX of the Educational Amendments Act of, I want to say, 1972, is sex. And we have a variety of court decisions, including from the Supreme Court, that have found that discrimination on the basis of sex includes discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and on the basis of transgender status or gender identity. So basically that means that we have this wonderful federal law that says you can't discriminate in the provision of healthcare or health insurance if you're receiving federal dollars. And almost every practitioner or insurance company does receive federal dollars. There's a few out there that don't, but between Medicare, Medicaid, various other funding systems, etc. I know your audience probably knows all this, but just in case.
I actually think that distinction is confusing to several clinicians. I've had this come up where, like, when they come up against transgender health care exclusions on policies, they're like, oh, that's not allowed because of the Affordable Care Act. And I'm like, well, in privately funded plans, it still is. Like, the Affordable Care Act, in the context of the Affordable Care Act, right?
Yeah.
The Affordable Care Act doesn't protect the right to access care in those privately funded plans. And where I always see it come up in my practice is union plans. So I work with a lot of folks up in Alaska who are members of different unions, and a couple of the unions up there exclude coverage.
Yeah, so and it gets really confusing here, because the insurance card you have might say Blue Cross Blue Shield, or whatever your local Blue Cross Blue Shield affiliate is. In my case, it's like Care First Blue Cross Blue Shield, but if you're wherever, it might be I'm blanking on some of the other ones, but
Premier, Blue Cross Blue Shield, they all have different,
they all have different names. But your insurance so your insurance card, looks like your insurance is through Blue Cross Blue Shield. But in a lot of cases, if you're working for a large company or a large union that has its own insurance plan, the insurance company is actually acting as an administrator rather than the primary insurer. And so in those cases, because the company, you know, whether we're talking about, you know, like a Fortune 500 company, like a huge law firm, you know, whatever, or the union itself or whatever, you know, they're not receiving federal funds for health insurance. They end up being not covered by those ACA regulations. Now, most insurance plans that cover like most people in the United States do fall under ACA because, you know, if it's a plan that's offered like by like Blue Cross or Anthem or, you know, whatever, you know, United Healthcare, you know, it's going to be, they're going to receive federal funding somewhere because, you know, they have plans on marketplaces, or they act as, you know, Medicaid administrators, or, you know, they have Medicare Plus programs or whatever. It's just, there's this weird area where just because their name is on your card, it's not necessarily covered because they're the administrator rather the insurer.
Right. Which trips up some of my patients sometimes because they'll go, you know, to like the Premera website and pull the Premera coverage guidelines, right? And I'm like, you actually need to call and verify your specific benefits, right? Because like your plan doesn't necessarily, your individual plan is not necessarily the Premera overall overarching thing, right? Like they might just be your administrator. And so it is a fucking hot mess. I wish it wasn't this confusing.
And figuring out what your individual plan does or doesn't cover is a freaking nightmare.
It really is.
And in fact, recently, we had a question about, you know, like, well, what private insurance plans, you know, in this state cover or don't cover this thing? And I was like, that's basically an impossible question to answer because you're looking at like hundreds or thousands of different plans that don't actually have their specific coverage information available in an easily accessible place.
No. Right. And this is like, we're getting a little in the weeds here, but I'm totally going to tell this story anyways. Right. In part, like this is an apolitical organization. We're talking about healthcare in general. I will always remind everyone to vote and consider voting for single payer healthcare systems because of this shit show that we're talking about right now. But, you know, like, for example, I was getting a test recommended by my gastroenterologist, right? It was like a methane test for like bacteria in my tummy or whatever. And I was trying to figure out the cost of the test prior to doing it. Cause like the risk of me having the thing we were testing for was very, very low, right? So it was kind of like, do I really need to do this test? And my cutoff point for myself was like, okay, if it's under $400, I'll do it. If it's over $400, I don't think it's worth it. And I got 3 different quotes, right? Because like I'm a KP member, it's an HMO, but that test isn't offered through KP. I had to do it through our university system. So I got a quote from my university system, I got 2 different quotes from KP. None of the 3 quotes were the same, and none of them were what I actually paid for the test. So at the end, like the person who was like the most confident in giving me the quote was like, it's going to be $379. I was like, motherfucker, it's like right on the edge of my budget that I made for myself. But I was like, okay, I'll do it. I got a bill like months later for $25. And I was like, how are we supposed to plan? Like, how are we even supposed to make these decisions when you know, we can't even understand the cost of care, like for the singular test. And I think it's just, you know, like I said, we're getting a little in the weeds. They put in the Good Faith Estimate Act that's like asking healthcare practices to offer estimates. And I feel like what's happening is like people are overinflating estimates in order to protect themselves from later on people. Because, you know, if there's a more than $400 difference, people can come back and say, I want my money back, right? And so it's just like, it's a fucking shit show. Health insurance is really
truly is.
And I think to get back to our audience and like their primary concern, right? This is what our trans patients have to deal with every day.
Yeah.
Trans and gender diverse patients need to access care more frequently than their cis peers in order to like get access. Not every trans patient wants, medical affirmation, and not every trans patient wants surgical affirmation. There is no one way to be trans. There's no right way to be trans, but so many of us do. And we have to go through this, like trying to become competent in health insurance and competent in navigating the system. And it's exhausting. And, one of my other partners the other day had a potential HIV exposure and was trying to access PEP and just ended up like paying $400 for it, because by the time like they found a pharmacy that had the drug that could get it to them in time, like they were so exhausted from that, like multiple pharmaceutical calls and like just the anxiety around like, do I need to take PEP? Do I not? They couldn't, on top of that, then deal with like accessing some of the patient assistance programs. It was just like too many levels and layers, and it's like that cost to all of us, right?
Yeah, I had a relatively minor surgery right at the beginning of the pandemic. And it was like, I was literally like, am I going to be able to get in for this, or is my surgery going to be canceled? Because it was like right at the beginning of March 2020.
Wow.
But I remember when I got home afterwards, they gave me like prescriptions for painkillers and various things. And I had so much trouble getting the painkiller prescription filled that I ended up just never doing it, because I went to multiple pharmacies and they were like, oh, we don't have any in stock right now, and we can't tell you when it will be available, and you can't call to find out if they have it in stock. You just have to go to various places. And I was just like,
you've had surgery and you're in pain.
Yeah. And I'm like barely like, I'm making my wife drive me around and things. So yeah, I just ended up dealing with like ibuprofen and like alternating ibuprofen and Tylenol for, like a few days, rather than actually having something that was more effective.
Right.
But that's just the fun of our medical system. And I know we've gotten way off topic now.
We'll circle back to, we were looking at like the federal picture of access to gender care with the ACA.
Yeah.
We'll get back.
So we had the ACA passed in 2010, and it has like these sort of generalized principles of non-discrimination in it. So, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex or race or disability status, etc. But that doesn't provide a lot of guidance. So in the late Obama years, I believe they released the draft rule in 2015, and it was adopted by the Department of Health and Human Services in 2016. They adopted some regulations under the ACA that tried to go further and explain what the Department of Health and Human Services understood discrimination to include. And that included a lot of really fabulous language about healthcare for transgender people, not denying care to someone based on the gender marker on their, insurance card that you would provide to someone else if they had a different marker, saying that insurance plans couldn't just per se say we're never covering any gender affirming care, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of fabulous regulations. The problem was, first, we immediately saw the regulations challenged in a basically selectively picked court in Texas, where opponents were like, which court can we go to where we're most likely to find a judge who's most likely to say this is this goes too far, and I'm going to strike it down across the whole country. So they found that judge in Texas, and he said, basically, everything in this about gender identity, I'm striking down. And then that wouldn't have necessarily been a problem if, say, the 2016 election had gone differently. But because we ended up with the Trump administration, they decided not to appeal. And they also didn't want to fix the rules to, comply with any technical flaws. I would say there weren't technical flaws, but I would have gone through the appeal process and said, no, this is wrong. But I mean, there's a number of options that were available. But because of the administration and its hostility to trans folks, that's not what happened. And in fact, instead, in late 2019, the Trump administration issued new rules or draft new rules that completely cut out all of the protections for gender identity. And those went the final version of those rules, after a huge public comment period, those were released, I want to say, like within 3 days or something like that of the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock, which was the employment non-discrimination case that said that the Civil Rights Act, when it said, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex, that includes sexual orientation and gender identity. So immediately courts struck down the Trump era rules. And I know this is getting into the weeds, but I think it's helpful to sort of understand this broad context.
Yeah, it's a good overview.
Yeah. So so immediately the courts were like, well, clearly you have to consider this Supreme Court decision that says that this is discrimination.
Yeah.
So those were struck down. And then after the 2020 election, we had the Biden administration come in, and they had this situation where the 2016 rules had basically been struck down, at least in part. The 2020 rules had been struck down. And so there's this question of what are the rules and what's going on here and what really constitutes discrimination.
Yeah.
So earlier this year, the Biden administration released new draft rules that pick up a lot of what was in those Obama era regulations, but add some additional things that are really fabulous. So for instance, one of the huge additions that's just really stellar is it includes protections for intersex individuals, which has really been like needed for decades. So the current status of that is that the public comment period for those rules closed on October 3rd. And currently the Department of Health and Human Services is reviewing all of the comments, of which there were something like 50,000. And they have to read through all of them and respond to them in some way before they can issue the final rule. Now, the way that the response often works is they're like, we got a lot of comments that said X. Here's our response to all 30,000 that said X. So they don't have to do 50,000 pages
responses. Yeah.
But so our hope is that sometime in 2023, we'll see final rules from the Department of Health and Human Services that put back into place and expand on those protections that we should have really been having since 2016.
Right. And to be clear, the original ACA, all of the protection that came with that still stands, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah. Just for all of our listeners, what CP is saying, all of the kind of rulemaking helps clarify and extend the protections, but none of it has changed the original protections.
Yeah. So for instance, you can still bring a claim under the ACA, under 1557 of the ACA, saying, I've been discriminated against by this healthcare provider or this insurance company because they've done X. But then you would have to demonstrate in court that, the thing that they've done constitutes discrimination. These regulations would include rules that say, like denying care in these specific situations or denying coverage in these specific situations is always discriminatory. So it eliminates that need to prove that something is discriminatory, and you can just say, well, this has been done, ergo you violated the regulations. It eliminates the number of steps, and it makes it a lot easier to challenge things and for those challenges to move along speedily.
Right, which will also make challenges more affordable for our community as a whole, right? And so oftentimes when these things are challenged, right, I was working in Alaska when the suit was brought against Alaska State Medicaid for excluding gender affirming care coverage, right? And none of our patients and folks that participated, like, were paying the attorneys, right? Like, that was all funded through ACLU grant funding and things like that. But that's all money we could spend advocating somewhere else for other protections, because like CP and all the other people involved in these lawsuits and these advocacy processes obviously need to be compensated for their time. And so, yes, very exciting to see what happens with these new rules.
Yeah, so the sort of addendum to this is also that because we've been waiting on these regulations, the Department of Health and Human Services has not been particularly active in enforcement, in part because of the way that the decision on the 2016 rules was written. So we really have been waiting for these new rules to go into effect to give the Department of Health and Human Services teeth to start going after providers, insurance companies, and states that are putting restrictions on the ability of trans people to access healthcare.
Yeah.
And there is actually a fabulous provision in the draft rules. We'll see if it survives for the final rule, but I loved it, which says basically like a inconsistent state law that said, this is not verbatim, this is, from my memory, but an inconsistent state law that, says that as a policy, the state doesn't believe that gender affirming care is ever necessary isn't an excuse for denying care to someone. So that would go really far in, being able to challenge a lot of things that we're seeing at the state level.
Right. And then let's go to the state level then now, right? I feel like that was good. I feel like you set yourself up for that perfectly.
Perfect segue. Yeah, exactly. So there are 50 states plus a number of territories. And so, it's really important to know that what's the case in one state might not be the case elsewhere. And so we have some states that are truly fabulous on access to healthcare for trans folk, and there are states that are truly awful. And so, we have been pushing the good states to be better, and the, kind of in-between states to adopt the practices that the good states have. And we've been in the not so great states trying to combat some of the worst tendencies that we see going on. So to provide an example, there's been on the sort of bad side, and I'll talk about some of the good stuff in a minute. But on the bad side, we're seeing a number of states in the past few years have been seeking to ban gender affirming care, especially for minors. So we've seen these bans pass in a few states. Arkansas was the first one. Arizona recently passed one. And I know there's at least one more that I'm blanking on. You can
say Alabama?
Alabama. There we go. Yeah. I know. I knew
all the A states are really.
Yeah, really. There's all the A states have just gone for, banning the gender affirming care. And then there's other states that, are kind of like, well, we're going to do this just as soon as we have our, legislature back in session. Or, there's other states that have considered things, but they haven't passed. But they have passed in a number of states. And it's very terrifying, for people who live in those states to suddenly be like, oh, wait, am I going to be able to continue to access care myself or to provide, care for my kids, depending on what the case is. Fortunately, thus far, we've seen courts granting injunctions against the enforcement of any of these laws. So none of them have gone into effect. But whether that's going to be what we see going forward is an open question, especially given how conservative the Supreme Court is. So, it's possible to get lower courts to say, oh no, this is, this clearly violates the Constitution, etc. But once we get it up to the Supreme Court, once it's appealed up, it's not quite clear what they'll do at that point. Now, I would say, based on existing precedent that we've seen, both from the Supreme Court and elsewhere, that the answer is clear, that these sorts of laws are unconstitutional. But again, the court has become so radicalized that existing precedent is no longer something you can rely on, as we saw earlier this year with the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade. So it's very worrisome in that regard. But I wanted to sort of give you a little bit of an example of what we're sort of seeing in some states. So I'm going to talk about Florida and Texas, because they're two interesting examples of states that we've not seen legislative bans, but we are seeing a lot of other really scary actions by the states.
Right. And I'm going to pause you for a second just to point out. So the states that did pass legislative bans, I just want to point out that CP did mention that a court placed injunctions on all of the bans that have been placed. So for healthcare clinicians, you are still allowed to provide gender affirming care to adolescents in those states. It's not like you're not legally prohibited from providing care. You are not risking your license to do so. And then, the CP's transitioning into talking about Florida and Texas, because they're not legislative actions. They are outside of the legislation. Florida, actually, I don't know about Texas specifically. Florida's where I grew up, so I follow a little more closely. Florida actually had a piece of legislation introduced to ban healthcare for minors, and it failed. Like their legislation did not sign it into place. And now their medical board, is actually taking action. So CP, tell us more.
Yeah, so there are a lot of these bills have been raised in a lot of states, and there are a few that have passed, and there are a lot that haven't. And Florida, as you say, is one of the states where there was a bill introduced and it didn't go anywhere. But that was not like the fact that the bill was introduced wasn't enough for certain conservatives in the state. And so instead of sort of waiting to see what the legislature would do in 2023 when they come back into session, we saw a number of executive agencies within Florida start taking action themselves without legislative authorization. So earlier this year, the agency that runs the Florida Medicaid program, I'm blanking on what its specific name is, but they issued this study that was basically like, is gender affirming care like something that is within good medical practice, or is it something weird and experimental? And they reached this decision that gender affirming care was experimental, and so it should not be covered by the state Medicaid program. Now, this was completely in opposition to all medical science, the opinions of medical associations that have looked at the issue, all of the testimonies submitted, but they cherry picked the experts that they wanted to look at, and they found people who are like, oh no, this is totally experimental and bad. And so as of earlier this year, I believe it was August, the Florida Medicaid program stopped paying for any sort of gender affirming care. More recently, and this has been truly terrifying, you mentioned this just a second ago, the Florida Board of Medicine and the Florida Board of Osteopathic Medicine have opened investigations and proposed rulemaking to prohibit physicians and osteopathic physicians licensed in Florida from providing gender affirming care to minors. And these rules, they proposed them after a meeting in which basically they only heard from opponents of trans healthcare. And all of the like trans youth, trans advocates, people who had like driven to Orlando from across the state, to be able to tell their stories, they were all told, we don't have time for you today. You should just go home, and you could submit something through the online form. So they had a public comment period open for 21 days, which is a very short amount of time for people to be able to find out that it exists and to pull together their reasoning. And that closed on Monday. So I will say that NCTE worked with a number of other organizations. In the end, we had 119 organizations that signed on to our comment with us, in which we basically told the boards of medicine and osteopathic medicine that their proposed rules were in opposition to established medical science. They were in defiance of recommendations issued by every major medical society that's looked at the issue, including the AMA, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Endocrine Society, the Pediatric Endocrine Society. My favorite was the Pediatric Nurse Practitioners Group, which is called NAPNAP, which I was just like, I could really go for a NAPNAP right now. Yeah. But, like statements from every organization that's looked at this, and they're like, oh, no, like gender affirming care is important. And so we talked about that. We talked about, how it's discriminatory in general. And we talked about the implication it's going to have for, physicians who are licensed in Florida, thinking about getting licensed in Florida, or who are licensed in multiple states, and how, there's going to be a lot of weird issues for, someone who's licensed in New York and Florida who's providing care in like New York. Is Florida suddenly going to start like actions against them? And also, what impact will it have on like Florida Board of Medicine investigations in other areas when they, try to report those to other state boards? So we hit on some things that I think a lot of other organizations were unlikely to hit on, but that are very relevant to medical practitioners.
Right, that integrated view from like a national level, I think is really important piece brought to the table. I think, the review document that stopped Florida Medicaid, it came from the Department of Health, and it was like a document done by, I want to say like some university. Like there were two reviewers who looked at data, one of whom was a dentist, like not an expert in the field. Dr. McNamara pointed that out during her testimony. And the Florida Medical Board, they did actually have they had 6 expert witnesses, 3 in opposition, 3 in support. And the oppositional witnesses, of the 3, only one actually works with trans youth, and she works with trans youth in Europe. She is not a licensed to practice medicine in the United States, and wouldn't be able to be licensed to practice medicine in the United States with further additional training, including a residency program. The other was an adult endocrinologist from California. And then the other expert was from the UK, not a healthcare clinician at all, a sociologist who is tenured, I think, at Oxford, and is actually under review for tweeting transphobic comments by the Oxford University. So great news there. And then the experts in support, Dr. McNamara from, I say Yale is where she is. And then University of Florida had a representative from their gender clinic. I can't remember the other person, but all 3 actually work with trans youth. Right. And so I think from the get, like, right, the Florida Board of Medicine states that they are an apolitical body, but they are actually appointed by the governor. So there is like really no way they can be apolitical. Their position is appointed by a politician. And so I think that statement, is just a load of horseshit, frankly. I think NCTE's response about like the bigger implications of what this means for clinicians licensed in multiple states is really important. I think it's important for Florida clinicians to know the comment period did end. The rule is not in effect as of yet. So currently, you can still provide gender affirming care to minors in the state of Florida. There are no restrictions on it. Medicaid won't pay for it, but other than that, it's still legal to provide that care. Although we've already seen several people stop just when the proposed rule came up on the table a few months ago.
Yeah.
And then the proposed rule does state like care for minors that have already initiated care can continue. It's like starting care for someone that cannot happen. And so you do not have to discharge your patients already receiving care. You don't have to stop their care. I think that's a really important thing for clinicians to hear.
That is a critical point that, I should have hit on.
Yeah. Yeah. And we did the same. I wrote like a 12-page response. My response was less about like this like national political, like all of this interconnectedness that you view as a large organization, and more about like, these are all the problems with your arguments and your expert witnesses. And like, you know, here's like the body of it. And I just called them out as, you know, making personally motivated decisions and choices that are going to kill people. So it didn't really mince words there. Right. And called them to task for violating their oaths as clinicians, right? Because we take an oath to do no harm. No matter how much you want to say about the research in our field being in its infancy and like the data being not as high quality as any of us want it to be, like these comments can definitely be seen as true to some degree, like depending on your perspective and how you're looking at this. And one, there are a ton of other fields in medicine that are exactly the same and we don't legislate away the right to care. Two, the data we do have, right, the data we do have that is decent quality shows that we have improved mental health outcomes, less depression, less thoughts of suicide, less attempted suicides, right? And that suicidal ideation goes down over the whole lifetime, not just like a year or 6 months from. Like we have like a good study with thousands of participants that shows lifetime reduction. And so those board members of that Florida Medical Board like are in violation of their oath to do no harm because they are increasing the likelihood of death by suicide for these trans youth. And so I think hands down, like their right to practice medicine should be absolutely examined and their licensure should be called into question. Of course, they're the board that would be doing that examination and questioning. So I doubt that that's going to go anywhere, but that's my personal thoughts.
Yeah, it's the point you were making about like the quality of research and the amount of research actually reminds me of the situation with medical research on marijuana, where we've had statutes in place that limit research that can be done, that limit funding for things, that expressly make it impossible to, you know, demonstrate that, you know, marijuana or cannabis derived things have a medical value. And it's not quite that awful with like trans healthcare, but we have lived with decades, you know, I mean, at this point, effectively a century of governments and funders saying, well, if you want to do this, you can do it on your own with your own money. And we're not going to fund it. And we're probably not going to publish it because we think that, you know, you're weird freaks. And, you know, when like, it's really hard to ignore the fact that the best evidence that we had about like gender affirming care in the 20th century was all burned by Nazis. Like the destruction of the Hirschfeld Clinic and it's like archives destroyed like decades of research. And like
that would give us this longer history too, that would go further towards making this case. And I want to be very, very clear. Like when I say like the research in our field is limited and it's kind of in its infancy, that doesn't mean that we don't have some high quality research. Like there's, you know, 16 great studies and one of the ones published last year had over 10,000 participants. So we're starting to get sample sizes that are much more of value, right? And so, and also, right, some of the like oppositional points on the research is like that we don't have RTCs. There's no way to do an RTC in gender affirming care. It cannot be done physically. Also, we like, if you wanted like RTCs on some of the things like we use like statins for, like there are many drugs we use that we would never do an RTC on, in part, you know, in part because, and like a review board would never approve it because like the existent literature that we do have says there's benefit, and so to like blind it and placebo someone would actually be causing harm, and you could never get approval to do that project. And so I think want to be very clear that the evidence we do have has some quality and value, and that it's not necessarily very different than what we see in some of the other fields that, again, are not legislated
Absolutely.
at all. So Florida's doing some weird shit right now. You can still practice in the state of Florida. And we're assuming, I talked to one of the physicians at the University of Florida Adolescent Clinic, we're assuming when they do enact the rule that a lawsuit is going to be brought.
Yeah, absolutely. That won't be us at NCTE because we don't have a like litigation arm. But I absolutely guarantee that one of the or multiple of the you know, litigation houses that focus on this sort of work, whether it's, you know, the ACLU or Lambda Legal, or you know, one of the other national or state-based orgs, you know, will be challenging this because it's really, like, I looked through the regulations that the Florida Board of Medicine and the Florida Board of Osteopathic Medicine have released in the past, like regulating the practice of medicine. And they're all things like when you prescribe, you know, when you prescribe opioids, you have to do it in this way. It's not, you cannot do this. And so this is really going, you know, of like several steps beyond what they've done in the past. You know, in the past, they've tried to ensure that where care is being provided, it's being done in, you know, sort of following best practices. And here they're saying, you just can't provide this care at all.
Yeah.
And that's a dramatic change from their own precedent.
Right, from their own previous regulations. I agree. I looked through some of them as well before I wrote my response and brought up a similar point as well. And yeah, I think Southern Legal and ACLU are probably going to be involved in this one. And so yeah, the public commentary closed on Monday, and we haven't heard any updates from them as of yet.
Not yet. I suspect that we probably won't see a final rule until sometime next year. Hopefully, we will. It won't be much before or possibly after the final rule from the Department of Health and Human Services on the Affordable Care Act. And so, you know, if that does include that provision I mentioned earlier about, you know, inconsistent state law or policy, then we'll see, you know, a federal regulation saying, doctors, we don't care what the Board of Medicine says. This is discriminatory. And then, because that's federal law, it preempts the state action.
And that's going to be really, I think, a really uncomfortable place for us as clinicians to be. Because just because there is a federal law saying that, like, you have, like, the state law is inconsistent and, like, federally you still have the right to practice, you are licensed by the state, and the state can still pursue action against you, right? And some of these states are trying to criminalize care, not just like make it like, right, with the Florida Board of Medicine, it's just you would go before the Board of Medicine, your license would be investigated, you might lose your license to practice, which is devastating in and of itself, right? Mm-hmm. But Arizona, was it Arizona that criminalized? I can't remember which one tried to actually Alabama tried to criminalize it. And so, like, you could be arrested, you could go to jail, you could potentially face prison time, right? And so how do you, as the clinician, know what to do? Obviously, right, like, we know in our heart, like providing care is like definitely the right thing to do. It's the thing that's in accordance with our oath to do no harm. And if we're put in jail, we can't take care of anyone. So like, how do we balance these things, right?
Yeah.
And particularly when we're licensed in multiple states. So I'm licensed in Florida. I take care of youth in Florida. If I'm facing charges in Florida, what happens to my, 400 other patients in other states that rely on me for their care? How do we do that math? How do we make those decisions? It's so complex.
So the good news is that state boards of medicine, and I very briefly a number of years ago worked for the Indiana Attorney General's office in their unit that in their medical licensing unit that did investigations for like the State Board of Medicine and the State Dental Board and all of that. So I have a little bit of insight here that I think is actually helpful for folks.
Yes.
And what the policy of at least all the Indiana boards was, you had to notify them if you had been like censured or, whatever in another state. And if the action that you were penalized for was something that violated Indiana regulations, then they would open up an investigation. But if it was something that was not illegal in Indiana, then they wouldn't have jurisdiction to open up an action. So we're likely to see situations where, someone who's licensed in Florida, if these rules ever go into effect, and I'm a little doubtful that we'll see them actually in effect. But if the Florida Board of Medicine or the Board of Osteopathic Medicine does bring action against someone and says, we're stripping your license because you provided gender affirming care to someone, and then they report that to the other state you're licensed in, that other state is likely to just ignore it as long as they don't have a similar rule. So, you don't necessarily have to worry about, the New York Board of Medicine or the Georgia Board of Medicine or, wherever, unless we start seeing other boards of medicine adopt the same sort of things.
Right. And one of the interesting things that California has done, right, is pass a law to be a sanctuary state. For I think you know better than me. I think it covers families and clinicians, right, offering gender affirming care. And so that's kind of an interesting approach as well.
Yeah, and there's a number of states that have been considering things along these lines. I know New York has something that they've been considering that's been raised with their legislature. I'm trying to remember whether the Connecticut bill covered gender affirming care, if it was focused on abortion, because that was one of the first ones that we saw post Dodd's. Yeah, so this is something that a number of states are taking up. There's also chatter about something along these lines in Maryland. And it's probably going to be, something that we see a lot of, what we think of as blue states taking up in the next legislative session or, in the next couple of years, especially as we see more and more hostile action by conservative state legislatures.
Right. I know in Washington, I'm part of like a coalition that is involved in pediatric gender care. And we've been trying to get in front of our legislators to like get some sanctuary state status as well.
And part of what those laws do is, they're all going to be a little bit different based on state, but, part of what they do is they say that, they won't provide, they won't respond to subpoenas, for certain types of things that aren't illegal in the state. So you can't, you can't subpoena California for medical records about, someone's abortion or gender affirming care that they received in California in order to, bring an action in Arizona against like them for, having received care or having, facilitated their children receiving care.
Yeah, right. And that was, I think, Arkansas is like, that was one of the weird thing in Arkansas is like they can't take kids out of the state, right? For care, like, which is like, you can't fucking, like, that's not, like, that's, you can't legislate that. That's like, so, and it's interesting to me that they even put that in because like the likelihood of that getting struck down by a judge seems much higher to me than if they'd kept that part out, right? It's like, I think you can easily find a judge who's like, yeah, you shouldn't do trans care on kids. I think it's much harder to find a judge who says parents can't take their kids out of state.
Yeah, and because like one of the basic fundamental rights under the Constitution that like everyone in the judiciary agrees on is like the ability to travel within the United States.
Right.
And that's a like blatant restriction on the ability to, you know, travel to another state.
So weird.
Yeah,
and what's happening? Tell us about what's happening in Texas.
Yeah, so Texas, the situation there has been complicated by the fact that the Texas legislature does not meet every year. They meet every other year. So they're going to be coming back into session in 2023, but in 2022, they didn't have a session. But basically, the Texas government, in the meantime, was like, we really want to do something to show that we're being tough against like trans kids. And so early in 2022, the Texas Attorney General and Governor, well, the Texas Attorney General issued a memo saying basically that providing gender affirming care to minors is child abuse and should be investigated by the Department of Child Safety and Welfare, or whatever it's specifically called in Texas. And then like very shortly after this memo was issued, the Texas Governor Abbott issued an order to the department to investigate parents of trans kids who were facilitating their kids receiving gender affirming care, with the intention of, you know, potentially taking their kids away from them and putting them into the foster care system or whatever. So this was absolutely horrifying because it leapfrogged over everything else to, we're going to take your kids away from you if you affirm their gender and if you do anything to help provide them with care. So unsurprisingly, immediately there was litigation to challenge this. And it's been frustrating because the side of Texas parents keeps winning, but in ways that are irritatingly restricted each time. So initially, a judge, like a trial judge in Texas, issued an injunction against this, saying, "Oh yeah, you've demonstrated that this is, you know, discriminatory. You know, it's a violation of constitutional rights, et cetera, et cetera." And then the Texas Court of Appeals immediately was like, "Oh well, those plaintiffs demonstrated that, so you can have an order as to them, but anyone else in the state has to bring their own lawsuit."
Oh God.
Yeah. And so, you know, this was challenged at various levels. It went up to the Texas Supreme Court, and they basically had a very wishy-washy decision that was like, well, you can't charge these specific parents. You can potentially charge other people, or you can open investigations against other people, but you don't have to. They said basically, well, the governor's order was illegal, but investigating the families wouldn't be illegal as long as they don't have the specific, you know, order covering them specifically, which is just some real bullshit. Because it's basically like the court was basically trying to have their cake and eat it too, of saying, well, you've clearly overreached, but we're not actually going to do much to stop. Like if the department just decides to keep doing this. So the latest is that a broader injunction has been issued for, I want to say, the families that are members of Texas PFLAG. They were able to sort of file as a group. But there's this amorphous situation for other parents of trans kids in Texas. And as a result, we've seen a lot of families like trying to look into moving out of state. But that's a horrific solution for people who, they've lived their whole lives in the state, all their family are there, that's where their job is, like to suddenly have to move like across the country to, hopefully be safe, and hopefully not have your kids stripped away from you because you're just doing your best as a parent to give them the care they need. It's just horrific. So Texas is definitely high on the list of states that we expect to see an attempt to ban gender affirming care through the legislature in 2023. And, we're going to combat it definitely, but it's...
Do y'all expect to see less legislation in 2023? Because I know part of 2022, it was midterms, right? So I know in the circles I move in, we've talked about the fact that like these legislative actions are very often to like garner like that conservative religious right voting bloc. Are we thinking like the numbers are going to keep going up in 2023? Are we hopeful that absent of midterms, they will be slightly less horrifying?
I expect we'll see more bills filed. Now, whether they pass is a different question. There's certainly a number that have already been pre-filed, or that legislators have already said, we are going to file this in a number of states. So, for instance, there was a situation in Oklahoma a couple of months ago where the state legislature stripped the Oklahoma University Medical Center of funding under the like COVID Relief Act unless they stopped providing gender affirming care to minors. And we're hearing that, the legislators are planning to bring a full ban on gender affirming care for minors in 2023. Again, that's something that we and, other national and state organizations, shout out to Freedom Oklahoma for the great work they have been doing, we're going to oppose because it's, it's not right to deny healthcare to trans kids. It's awful. It's discriminatory. It hurts everyone.
And just right, and to give people an idea of what CP and I are talking about, in 2015, right, there were 19 bills introduced that were like trans folks, right? Youth sports bills, bathroom bills, things like that. And then, by 2020, there were 66. I think in 2022, we've had over 200 this year, right? In 2022. And so that's when I was asking, like, are we going to see more or less for our listeners? And for our listeners, CP, what are actions that they can take as clinicians to kind of help, like, in this vein of advocacy and maintaining access to care for the kids in their states?
So if you are in a state where these sorts of bans or rules or legislation are being considered, first off, definitely speak out. In a lot of these cases, you have an opportunity to either testify, to submit a written statement, to make some sort of statement in support of your patients. Now, you don't necessarily have to do that as an individual, and in fact, sometimes it can be stronger when it's a group of physicians coming together, or you petition your state medical association to take a stance on the bill. There's a lot of like conservative states that they are thinking about things like this, but if they're like the state medical association came out in force and said you can't do this, that would be a real unexpected block to them. That would be an audience that has real sway in a lot of states, but hasn't necessarily gotten involved in these sorts of fights in the past. And so if you can get your state and local medical associations to really take this up, that would be hugely helpful in a lot of places. It's not going to be decisive everywhere, because there's some places where legislators are going to do what they're going to do. And there's some states like Oklahoma where there isn't an opportunity to provide testimony to the legislature. They just don't have that built into their system. In most states, like you can go and testify, on
you can call your representatives in those states. So
you can absolutely call.
Yeah, you can, particularly if you are a member of that state, if you live in that state, you get to call, your representatives and talk to them. And well, you don't get to talk directly to them.
You talk to a nice staffer who will take your message and type it into a computer system. And
yeah, and we actually the APA actually has a great template for like how to make a statement to one of your legislators. And so on our Queer Doc blog, we kind of using their template helped shift that towards talking about access to gender affirming care. So that's there for clinicians that they can use and just have a templated thing to say. You still need to put some stuff of your own words and experience. That's what makes it a meaningful statement. But that can help. So definitely like speaking to your legislators. You mentioned too, you had so many people sign on to the letter y'all wrote and on the public comment to Florida. So oftentimes being on the mailing list of like NCTE, at your local ACLU, and any other organization.
Most states have a state level queer organization. If you want to find out what your like state level queer organization is, you can go to the Equality Federation website. I think they're equalityfederation.org. They have a list of all their affiliate organizations. Now, not everywhere does. And the list of states that doesn't is kind of entertaining because it's like either extremely conservative states or extremely liberal states.
Like, we don't need it there.
Yeah. And then there's a few that don't, that it's like, interesting. Like, there's not a state level org in Pennsylvania, but Pennsylvania has the weird thing where it's like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and then like all this space in between. And so like there's Philadelphia orgs and there's Pittsburgh orgs, but there's not necessarily like a statewide org. Nice. But most states do have one, and get on those lists because they will keep you much more apprised of what's going on with your state legislature than the national orgs will.
Right. And you can also as a clinician, you can ask one of your like clinical support team members or staff members to do this depending, I have a private practice. So like how my staff helps support me is very individualized to our needs. And so when it comes to like anti-trans stuff, I'm actually very on top of that, but like we're also involved in some advocacy for over-the-counter birth control and for access to controlled substances without required first in-person visits, right? Which is primarily focused on treating people with substance use disorders, but actually is very applicable in trans care because of testosterone, right? And my, like kind of one of my teammates, one of my assistants does all of that tracking for me, right? They stay on top of that. They submit they sign us on to all of the things that get sent out to be signed on to in support of things that these other organizations have written. So like you can definitely, have someone help you do this and then just show you where to sign. Right, to help save some of your time. You can also do some more of this yourself. And easiest option is usually signing on to something another organization has written for you, but also, as CP mentioned, writing your own comment can be really powerful. And then advocating within any organization you are a member of. And so CP specifically brought up state medical associations, but also if you, are a member of your a board of whatever medicine you're in, or your, local medical society, or whatever kind of organizations you are in, if you can, again, get a group of people together to make a statement that's signed on by all the individuals and endorsed by the organization, that's going to have a larger impact. And so that's an advocacy option as well. Other ideas for involvement advocacy, clinicians helping maintain access?
I think that's most of the things. Listen to your patients when they come in and, tell you that they have needs, or that, something is happening that's scaring them, because they'll often be more aware of what's happening than you will, and sometimes more aware than like what the state or local queer orgs are, depending on, what all they're having to deal with. I will say that, I used to work at Maryland's state level queer organization, Free State Justice. And, my time there, our staff wavered between like 3 people and 8 people. And, we were dealing with just so many different things. And like, we tried to keep, our finger on the pulse of everything going on in the state, but it was hard. And, there was a lot of relying on other organizations that were specialized in particular geographic areas or subject matter areas to, let them take the lead on things or give them to support when they took the lead on things, so that, like someone was on top of everything.
Right. And I think that's such an important point, right? Like we, as individual clinicians, don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? Like we can, again, by like getting on these mailing lists, by getting, following these organizations on social, like you can just amplify the advocacy that they are already doing, which actually is less time and energy for you, right? You can like repost social media shout outs. Like, so when, exactly what CP said, that Florida Medical Board public commentary period was 21 days. And so trying to get that amplified so people knew to go and make comments, right? Like reposting other, like Equality Florida did some great social around making comments and things like that, is really important. So I think like, right, when we saw this, when the Supreme Court removed the protection for Roe v. Wade, a lot of people were on Facebook like, you can come camping at my house. And it's like, hey, there are already a lot of organizations that are doing advocacy and access for abortion care. Why don't you just give them your time and energy instead of trying to like create a system that you don't need to create because it already exists, and your creation of it is probably going to actually be really bad because you don't know what you're doing and you have no experience. So
and you're creating a horrific paper trail of like evidence.
Yeah. Also, you're posting shit on social media. Like, come on, we know what's happening. So don't reinvent the wheel. Like, give your voice to these organizations that already have it. Or if you are part of an organization that isn't advocating and you have the time and energy, start working within your org. I think those are great options as well. Let's see what other, I feel like I've kept you forever, CP. I think we could talk like for another 2 hours. I'm trying to think if there are other things we should.
So one thing I did want to hit on is that, I've been talking a lot about, things that are horrible going on in states, but there's a lot of room for good things. And, there's like, you mentioned, the laws that states are passing to create like refuge. I'm sorry, I completely blanked on the term.
I think it's sanctuary states is
sanctuary states. There we go.
Called it.
Yeah. Sorry, I had COVID a few months ago, and my residual brain fog periodically makes me forget like a word that I'm like, it's just in my brain somewhere locked away. Yeah. So we're seeing sanctuary state bills. One thing that we're going to be seeing, in the next few weeks in Maryland, for instance. And again, Maryland, where I live, it's a great example here because it's a state that votes very heavily Democratic, but still has a lot of room for improvement in a lot of ways. So we've had, Medicaid coverage of gender affirming care since 2015. There's state laws protecting, prohibiting discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. Yes, this is Magic Cat. She's wandering past. So there's a lot of good stuff in place, but the 2015 policy that says, yes, Medicaid will pay for gender affirming care includes a list of like 31 things that they're not going to pay for. And, it's like, well, we're going to pay for these certain things that we see as like necessary, but all this other stuff we're considering cosmetic or not medically necessary.
Yeah, we had that in Washington, right? Our ACA had a list of non-covered services, and with the last piece of update to it, like one of the biggest things we asked them to do is remove the list of non-covered services. It's exactly the same.
Yeah, so we've been working for a few years to try to get that list struck down in one way or another. And right now we have a great situation where the newly elected, or the governor who's going to be coming into office in the beginning of January, who's been recently elected, Wes Moore, has said that he, will sign this bill if it's passed that will, remove these particular.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that's fabulous. There's some questions as to what the bill will look like, whether it's going to just eliminate those, carve outs, or whether it will say we'll affirmatively pay for things.
Right.
And there's questions that, we're expecting to get from, the bean counters and the legislature,
Right.
who are very concerned about the cost of everything.
Right. And then also, what is the process for approval, right? Because I think in Washington, we had this, it was a case by case basis. And so we could never figure out why things were actually getting denied, right? And we're that was really, really tough.
And that's a huge problem with our current insurance system in general, where even where things are required to be covered, insurance companies have an incentive to initially deny coverage. And then there's a decent chance you'll appeal and ask for it to be covered. And then they'll be like, oh yeah, I guess we have to cover this. But they know that a certain number of people aren't going to appeal.
Right. Yeah. Right. It's yeah, capitalism and healthcare don't work. FYI, newsflash, everyone.
It was capitalism all along.
But yeah, I think there are definitely states that are taking action to help protect trans youth, trans families, and clinicians. And I think CP's desire to take a moment to focus on that trans joy is really, really important. Right. I love that.
The other thing that we haven't seen specific movement on yet from any states, but where there's, huge potential, and that we might start seeing, this year, next year, soon, are affirmative protections of gender affirming care for minors. So, we're seeing conservative states ban gender affirming care, but we haven't yet seen, progressive states pass legislation that says this is affirmatively protected.
Yeah.
And this cannot be used, as a justification for, child custody hearings.
Services. Yeah.
Social services. It can't be, you can't be penalized for doing this. And we haven't seen that yet, but there's the hope that we'll start seeing that in the coming years.
Right. And some of those actions I think would be so important, which we didn't get into this topic, and we probably won't really get into it a ton because I've already kept you for so long. But this legislative action is harmful to the mental health and also probably long-term chronic health of trans and gender diverse people, right? This is minority stress in action, and we know that affects long-term health outcomes. And so definitely, I had one of my 17-year-old patients talk about how loud she felt all of this noise was, and how she felt like everyone was just calling her a pervert, right? And she is a child, and these are adults who are causing her this harm. And I think that affirmative legislative action, that voice of safety and acceptance and love, right, is can help counteract some of this negative noise. And so I think that is another really important part of advocating for these affirmative pieces of action to help combat just the mental health effects of all this negative legislative kerfuffle.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other closing words, CP, for our clinicians doing gender affirming care in this crazy political climate?
Yeah, I just want to thank all of you for doing the work that you're doing. This is absolutely critical, life-saving work that has been unfairly stigmatized by a lot of people. And so thank you for doing it. Thank you for sticking it out and dealing with, all of this ridiculous groomer rhetoric and people talking about mutilating kids and all sorts of stuff that's just patently false, but can be so hard to, you know, deal with on a day in, day out basis. So thank you all.
Yeah. And see, I feel like CP's thanks is like, in some ways it breaks my heart that this is something we say thank you for, because like it should just be like an everyday part of healthcare and an everyday part of life. And it's not. So I totally understand where CP's coming from. And particularly like, you know, layered against all of the legislative action that's been happening, we have had all of the attacks on children's hospitals from extreme right-wing groups right now, and, you know, including death threats to multiple of our physicians who are have larger face in the public space. And so our podcast episode from November, the one before this one, was actually around like digital security and protection. And it's been interesting to talk to some of my like cis colleagues who have like actually, some of them have taken a little bit of a step back, you know, and I'm in no way dismissing or saying someone shouldn't do the thing that feels right and safe for them and their family by any means as an individual. Please don't take my comment to mean that. It's interesting though to think about like where, like, right, CP and I, like, as part of this community, like, there's not a choice here for us. Like, there's, right, this is me, this is my partner, this is my family that people are trying to like legislate away. And so there is no stepping away from this. There is no backing down. There is definitely like trying to do it as safely and as legally as possible to maintain, again, that access to like my multi-state practice. But this is who we are. It's not just the work we do. So thank you so much, CP, for coming on and sharing about that.
Thank you for having me.